Welcome to this Wise Owl tutorial on working with tables in Power Automate, probably the longest tutorial so far in this series. So what we're going to learn in this tutorial is the following. We're going to learn how to create tables in Excel and the importance of doing that in order to be able to look at them in Power Automate. Then we'll look at how to load tables from Excel in Power Automate, how to select certain columns from a table, and then how to present that information as an HTML table. We'll then look at how you can format your HTML tables using CSS to make them look glossy, and then how to work with the other tables available in Excel. And then we'll look at three other cases: how to load SharePoint lists and considerations involved in doing that, how to load information from Outlook, such as lists of emails, and also how to load information from OneDrive, lists of files and folders. It's all very useful stuff. But that's enough for looking at me. I'm going to vanish now, and let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is create an Excel table so that we can import it. And to check that you can follow along, I'll do it from scratch. So we'll choose to go into OneDrive. And what I'm going to do in OneDrive, after clicking on My Files, is create a new folder. So click on Add New, and I'll call my new folder Films. And then click on that folder. You can now upload a file. So this file called Top 10 Films is one of two which are attached to this video, and you can get the web page giving the reference to the files from the notes for this video in YouTube. So I'll upload that, but to be honest, you don't really need it because any rectangular block of data would do. You could pretty much make your own, as long as it has headings going across the top of the columns, and I guess at least a couple of rows of data. So we've got there a table of data, except we don't. It's not a table. If you click on the drop arrow next to the range name box, there's no tables listed. And this matters because in Power Automate, you can only ever get data from an Excel spreadsheet online if it's defined as a table. So we need to create a table. And probably the easiest way to do that is to click on any single cell within the table, it doesn't matter which one. Click on Insert and choose to create a table. What it will then do is select the data. So it says B2 to E12. And if I show you what B2 to E12 is, you'll recognize the fact that it's pushed out to select the rectangular block of data bordered by blank rows and blank columns. It does that automatically. So what I can do is choose OK to confirm that, and I've got my table. My table is currently called Table 1. The reason I know that is when I click on this drop list, that's what it displays. But you can change that by clicking on the Table Design tab at the top there, going to your table name and calling it something more meaningful. So I'm going to call mine Films Table. I don't think you can have spaces in the table name. Now, just before we leave this, I'm just going to do a couple of other things because I want to show you something towards the end of this video. If you right click on the film spreadsheet, if you could please, and choose Duplicate. And what that will do is create a duplicate copy of the spreadsheet. What you can then do is right click on that to rename it. And if we could call that Other. And if you click on the table within this, so go to Table Design, and instead of calling it Films Table 3, if you call this Other Table. Quite what happened to Films Table 2, I don't know, by the way. So I've now got a spreadsheet containing, or workbook containing, two worksheets, two tables. We're good to go. There's no need to save that. Indeed, you can't. So I could just shut it down. And you can see my file has been created there, Top 10 Films. So what I'm going to do now is to try loading the data from Excel and displaying it in some useful format. So I'll create a new flow. It'll be an instant cloud flow because I want it to be able to run whenever I click on a button. I'll call it Load Films from Excel, choose to manually trigger a flow, and click on Create. So I want to add a step. And the step is going to be based on Excel Online Business. There's three types of tables you can bring in. You can bring in three types of list rather. You can bring in a list of all the worksheets. You can bring in a list of all the tables in an Excel workbook. But the thing I'm most commonly going to want to do is to list the rows present in a table. So that's what we're going to do now. If you click on that, we now need to answer a few questions. We need to say where the location is. It's OneDrive for Business. Which the document library is, it's OneDrive, which the file is called, so it's in the Films folder, And if that thing would move out of the way, it's called top 10 films. And finally, which tables it's in, and it's called films table. So now I can choose to save that. And what I'm going to do now is to run this. It's, as I've said before, it's a good practice to get into to see what is coming out from that. So if I run this, what I may need to do after clicking on Run Flow, depending on how quickly this runs, is to pause and come back to the video. And indeed, that's what I had to do. There's been a 5 to 10 second gap between me, which I thought you'd prefer not to watch. So if I click to download now, you can see what's coming out from this. It's JSON, as always. And what I need to do, as always, is understand this. As always, you can forget about the header section. That's irrelevant. The body section begins with the word body and consists of two main properties. One is called @data.context. That looks to me like an internal field I have absolutely no interest in, and so I'm going to disregard it. The other property is called values, or rather just value. And that contains a number of subproperties giving the column names. Out of those subproperties, the first two I imagine I'm not going to be interested in, but the last four give the rank, the title, the gross income for the film, and the year of release. And those I will be really interested in. So again, if you could remember that structure, please, because we're going to be using it in a second. Close that down. And what I'm now going to do is come out of this and try selecting data. So I'm going to show presenting this data in a usable format using two different ways. We're going to start with using the select command. So I'm going to add a new step. For the action, I'll choose a select command, which is one of the data operation commands. And I'll choose to select data. The place I'm going to get it from is the table of data. Now at this point, I want to do it wrongly first. What I want to do is choose value, which will give me the array of all the items in the spreadsheet or in the table. But let's suppose I didn't do that and chose one of the individual columns. I'll choose title. What will happen is quite confusing. It creates something called an apply to each loop. And what this will do is automatically loop over all the rows in the table, doing something for each film title. That's definitely not what I want to do at the moment. I'll cover apply to each loops in a couple of tutorials time probably, but for the moment I definitely don't want to show you this, nor do I want to do it. So what I'm going to do is delete that and try again. And the reason I showed you this is because you're quite likely to do it yourself, and it's frustrating when things go wrong and you have no idea why. So we'll try that one again. I'll choose the select command again. And this time, instead of choosing an individual column, I'll choose the entire set of rows. There's almost no difference between value and body, by the way. We'll choose value. So what I want to do now is pick up on two columns. The first column I want to pick up on is the title. And I want to call that film name. Except when I type in film name, like so, oh, it does accept it. I thought it wasn't going to accept a space on this occasion. And what we're going to do for the second column is choose to pick up on the year, and I'll call that release year. So those are my two columns I want to display, and the column names I'll give them. If you let your mouse linger over one of these columns, you'll see it contains an expression which says from that particular row, pick up the field called title or the field called year. So now what I can do is try testing that. And if I try running this, when it's saved, and then if I look at the output from this, you can see that, look at the raw outputs, you can see I've got exactly what I wanted. I've got an array with two properties within it, the film name and the release year, ready to use. And to be honest, that's already a pretty good result. But what we'll now do is something which is even better, and look at creating this and presenting it as an HTML table. So what I'm going to do now is to create a parallel branch so I can still look at my select statement, and I will use an HTML command. It's one of the data operations we've looked at again, and what I want to do is create an HTML table. I use this a lot in Power Automate. So I'm going to get my data from the value, the list of all the items as I did before. What I'll do is just try running that without any alteration whatsoever to see what happens. So if I try running that flow and then look at the output from it, you can see it presents me with an HTML table, and there it is. It's good, but it possibly is a bit too detailed. So it contains columns which I'm not particularly interested in. I just wanted the title and the year. So what we'll do is come out of that and choose Show Advanced Options. Now what this allows you to do is choose specific columns. So I'm going to choose Custom there. And I'm going to choose my first column is the title. And I'm going to call that film name with a space in. And this time you really can't type a space in, or can you? And I'll call this release year. Again, I can't type a space in, and I'll pick up in the year. Here's one of the most peculiar things about Power Automate. You can't type a space in, but you can copy one in. So if I type in something like Notepad, the words film name, and then if I go back into this and paste that into that box, it accepts it bizarrely. How strange is that? So if I now try running this again, I'm going to get the same thing, but this time my HTML table will contain just 2 columns. And it already is going to look quite pretty, actually, as you'll see in a second. That's quite nice. Now what I could do is to pick up on this output and email it to myself, for example. What I'm going to do is choose to create a new step underneath both these 2 actions to send an email. And I will send it inevitably to myself. And the subject will be films, and the body of the text could be the output, either from the HTML table or from the other select statement. So I'm going to choose the output from the HTML table. And then if I save that, and if I run this one more time, choose to run it. While that's happening, I think I'll just go into Outlook to see the answer. So that should have run by now and should have sent me my email. It's looking good. And if I go into Outlook, you can see my email containing the HTML table of all the films. So that's a very nice way to pass information between different programs or between different applications. What we'll now do is look at making this look even nicer by applying CSS styles to make this look really pretty. So what we're going to do now as the pièce de résistance is format our HTML. One way to do that would be to get something to appear before the output, giving a definition of all the styles. And your considerate presenter has given you access to that. So if you look at some of the files attached to this video, which as I said, you can get at by looking at the YouTube notes, you can see that there's a file called html_tablestyling.txt, which contains some sample HTML styles. You don't have to know much about HTML. This will take any table, apply a 1 pixel solid border around it, set a background color, light gray by the look of it, and a few other things besides. But obviously you can type in your own styles as well. So what I'm going to do is select all of that and copy it to the clipboard. And then back in my flow, I'm going to put it into a variable. So I'll add an action before the final one. And what this action will do is to initialize a variable. And I'll call my variable CSS. It's going to be a text variable, and it's going to contain all this CSS. So then what I can do is go to my send email task. And before I put my output in, I can put the CSS in. So if you think about what this will compile, it will have a load of CSS defining how tables should appear, and then an actual table itself. So the results should be more attractive. So let's try doing that. If I now save that, and if I try running it, I'm sorry about these pings, I keep meaning to turn them off. If I go to Outlook, there was my original table, and here's the one which has just arrived, much nicer. And obviously then you can format it any which way you want. So I personally think the best way to send information is as a formatted HTML table, if you have the time and energy to apply a CSS to make it look nice. So I promised, I think, that we would create some other lists from Excel information. So let's do that. What I'm going to do is create another flow. I'll call it show Excel lists, manually trigger it and choose create. choose New Step, go to Excel, and what I'm going to do is show you what the other two tables you can get at look like. So the first thing I'll do is get the worksheets. I need to choose rather tediously where I'm getting them from, which is OneDrive for Business. I need to choose OneDrive, and I need to choose My File. And choose Save. And then I'll add another action underneath that, which will do a very similar thing in Excel, but instead of getting the worksheets, what it will do is get a list of all the tables. I don't know if you remember that I got you to create a second worksheet and indeed a second table, and the reason I did that is just so you can see something more exciting from this than a single worksheet and a single table. So I can now choose my second file, and what I'll do without any further ado is just run that to illustrate how this is going to work. So if I test that and have a look at the output, what I'm expecting to see is 2 worksheets and 2 tables. So you missed about 5 seconds or so waiting there, which I spared you. So there's the output from getting the worksheets. You can see there's 2 worksheets, and for each worksheet it gives you the name of the worksheet and some other information about it, its position, whether it's visible or not, and so on. So you could get at that. And for the second action to get the list of tables, you can see this is the output it gives you. So from this, you can see it's given me a bit more information actually for each table, the name of the table, and all sorts of other information about it. To be honest, some of it I don't understand, but it includes things like whether you're showing alternate columns and rows in different colors and so on. So that's other information you can display about Excel. So what we're now going to do is to look at how you can upload a SharePoint list. And because I want this tutorial to be as self-standing as possible so that you can work your way through things, we'll create the list first. If you go to SharePoint, so I'm going to click on the waffle and choose to go to SharePoint, and make sure you've selected one of your SharePoint sites. What I'm going to do is create a list. In fact, I'm going to import it from an Excel file. So I can click on the icon to create a new list. I can choose to get my information from Excel. And if we look quickly in Excel, you can see that's what the file is going to look like. So it's a set of 1200 movies, and it contains various details for each. I'm just going to shut that down just in case there's any problems working with an open file. And what I'm going to do is upload that file. So I'll choose the movies file, and that's provided with this tutorial. You can see where it is by looking at the notes for the YouTube video. And you can see I've got a list of films here. There's only one table in the file, it's called Films. And for each of the columns, you've got a column header. And you might think, looking at this, for example, that the genre field is called genre. As we'll discover, it's not. It's probably called something like field_4. So what I can do is choose next to go on to the next stage. I can choose create, and what it'll do is create my list. Now I'm going to leave that chugging away in the background. When I come back to it, it will actually display the list, but it takes quite a while to refresh. So let's go back now to Power Automate and create a flow which will actually import that. So if I choose to create a new flow, I'm going to make it an instant cloud flow, and let's call it load SharePoint list. And I'll choose to manually trigger the flow. Let's have a quick look. No, still not updated. I'll create a new step, and what it will do is take a SharePoint file or SharePoint list, click on the SharePoint actions, and what I want to do is to get items from SharePoint. So you can see if I scroll down, there is an action called get items. It's often quite difficult guessing which action you should choose. So I'm going to choose my site, which is the Power Automate video tutorial. I'm going to choose my list, which hopefully is now in the list. It is, it's movies. And what I want to do now is one other important thing. I'm going to click on Show Advanced Options. And this allows me to set some things called OData filters. Now I've got a separate tutorial coming up on OData, but for the moment I'm just going to say I want the top 10 records. This is vital. Power Automate can run very, very slowly if you access a lot of records, because for each record it will go back to the cloud server. And I think Microsoft starts sulking and start returning the data more slowly. So we're just going to pick out the first 10 films. And there they are, by the way, they've refreshed. So what I can now do is to try running this. So if I save this, and then having done that, I'll just collapse that and try running it. You may notice a bit of a theme here that I always run things after doing anything. And what you should see is the output from this, when I run it, is a set of the first 10 films. So if I look at the output from that, if I download that, you can see I've got the usual header section at the top, and then I've got the body section. And again, I'm going to ask you to remember that this is the body section and it contains a value section. Each, I guess, record within that is a film. So the title of the film is given by the title column, because every SharePoint list has to have a title field. But all the subsequent fields have somewhat surprising names. For example, the director field is called field_5. Who would have guessed it? I'm going to go on a slight digression here, just in case anyone finds it useful, and just show you how you can find the name of a field in SharePoint, because it took me a very long time to find this out. There may be a better way, but I never found it. So here's my SharePoint list. How can I find out the true name of that field? Well, one way to do it is to click on the settings at the top right, choose to look at the list settings, and then scroll down and find the field you're interested in, which in this case is the director column. So I can click on that and then go to the URL, go to the end of this, and can you see right at the end it says field 5. So that is the name of that field, and that's the only way I can find to determine what a field is called. And that's the end of that digression. So I'll close this down. And what I now need to do is to display this in a table, perhaps. So I'll go back into editing my flow. I'll add a new step. And because I really like my HTML way of displaying information we've just learned, what I'll do is display this in HTML format. So I'll create an HTML table. The information I'm going to get is from the value. So that's from the output from the previous table. And I'll choose advanced options and choose custom. Whoops. So I can specify my columns. Now at this point, you can disregard what I told you about needing to know the SharePoint field names, because I can just refer to them from this list. So for example, if I want to show the title, I can call that title, and I'll rename that as title. And if I want to show the director, for example, I can just click on the word director. So it shows the visual representation of the column rather than its true underlying field name. And I'll call that director too. So here's what's happening behind the scenes. The value is taking the output from the previous action, which is called get items, and it's looking at the body section, and within that the value section. For each item, each row, it's then picking out the field called title, and it's picking out the field called field_5. You don't need to know this yet, but it's all good background information for future tutorials, believe me. So what I can now do is to save that and try running it. Okay, and it's taking a while to save, so if I click on test and choose to run this, and what I'm hoping I'll see at the end of it is 10 films and 2 columns. Look at the output from this, you can see a neatly formatted HTML table where the 2 columns are requested and the first 10 rows. So it's all worked. So what I want to do in the closing parts of this tutorial is just give lots of examples of tables in Power Automate. So we've done Excel, we've done SharePoint, let's try Outlook. Let's list out the subjects of our Outlook emails. So if I go into Outlook, you'll see that my inbox contains 3 emails. That will do. And what I'm going to do is list out the subject and maybe the send date of each. 2 of the films, by the way, have got the same subject, films. So to do this, I need to create a new flow, obviously. So I'll create an instant cloud flow. I'll call it list Outlook emails. And then we'll choose manually trigger the flow and choose create. So I need a new step. And what I'm going to do is go to my Outlook actions. And what I want to do is get all my emails, or list all my emails. So if you scroll down, you can see the things like getting calendars. That sounds interesting. You can find all your meeting items. You can get your contact folders, get your contacts. So you can get to pretty much any aspect of Outlook. I want to get to just the emails. So I'm going to choose that item. I'm going to go to my inbox and pick out all the emails. But there's one thing I want to change. If I go to Outlook, you can see I've actually read 2 of my 3 emails. At the moment, it's only fetching the unread messages. So I just need to have a quick look down the option is set by default for filtering messages and change that to no. So I get all the 3 messages. And what I can now do is to save that. And then what I'll try doing is running this to see if it gives me the 3 emails and to inspect the JSON returned. So I'll click on test, choose to manually run it, and click on continue and click on run flow. And what we should do after a second or 2 is list out the emails. Inspect the output of that. You can see that it's becoming familiar now. You've got the header section, and then you've got within the body section, you've got a value subsection, and within that you've got 1 entry for each email. So looking at the first one, for example, you can see that this is the information it returns, and what I'm going to do is pick out the subject property. And I think I said I'll pick out the date. Maybe I'll pick out the received date time too. So that's the information available to me. It's now just a question of presenting it nicely. And to do this, we'll add a new step and use an HTML table. So what I'll do is create an HTML table. I'll take the output from the previous section. It can be hard to find this. Previously, the value has been at the top. It's now moved down to the bottom. And don't forget, if I choose any one of these fields, what it will automatically do is create an apply to each loop instead, which definitely isn't what I want at this point. So I need to scroll down and find either the body or the value section. The value section is a list of the response objects, i.e. the emails, so that's what I want. And what I can then do is choose to show custom options, my HTML table, and I can choose to pick up on the fields I wanted. So I said we'd have the subject, and I'll call that subject. And I said we'd also have the receive date if I can find it quickly. Receive time, let's try that. And I'll call that when. If I now save that, and then if I run this, what you should see is it gives me an HTML table with 2 columns in. The first column will be the subject, and the second column will be when it was received. So let's have a look at that. And there's my 3 emails, and for each I've got the subject and when it was received. And although I've only done this to get to just emails, you can see that it gives me access to any part really of Outlook: contacts, appointments, messages, attachments, whatever you choose to get at and manipulate. So for the last part of this tutorial, having looked at Excel, SharePoint and Outlook, let's have a look at OneDrive. So if I go into OneDrive, you can see within my files, I've got a folder called OneDrive Recipes. Any folder would do. And what I'm going to do within this is create a new folder. And I'll call this test folder. And the reason I'm doing this is because what we're going to do is list out the files in this folder. But what Power Automate will do is treat the files and folders identically. And it will just have a flag saying for each one whether it's a file or a folder. So I should get 3 entries in my results. And what I'll then do is filter that to show just the files. To do this, I can go and create a new flow. And I'll choose an instant cloud flow. I'll call it load OneDrive files and folders, because that's what it's going to do. We'll manually trigger it and click on create. So the first thing I need to do is to add a step in, and it's going to be a OneDrive step. And what I want to do is to list all the files. And there's 2 possible actions I can choose. I can either choose list files in root folder, or the more flexible list files in folder at the top. So I'm going to choose list files in folder because I don't want to go to the root. I can choose my folder. So I'm going to go to my OneDrive Recipes folder. And what I can then do is to try running this to see what I get as a result. You may be spotting a theme in the way I'm approaching every single flow here. It's always the same. Save it, test it, and then move on to the next stage when you know the structure of the JSON file. So if I now test that with my 4 or 5 mouse clicks, which can get a bit galling after a while, and then have a look at the output returned from this, you can see that in my raw outputs, I've got what I expected. I've got my 3 files. Now the first one listed there is a test folder, and it's got a property called isFolder, which is set to true, whereas the other two isFolder is set to false. And what I'm going to do is filter these to show only the files. So I need to go back into editing this. Now by far the best way to do this is using something called OData, but we haven't done a tutorial on that yet. It's coming up. So instead I'm going to choose a filter task. And what I will do is filter the array. So the array I'm filtering is the value, and blessedly it works out that the only thing I could possibly filter is a set of all the rows. So it doesn't give me a huge range of choices here like it normally does. So I can just choose value. I want to filter it where the value, and I'm going to pick up the field which contains whether it's a folder or not, which is isFolder. And I'm going to pick out where the isFolder is set to false. As I discovered when preparing this, you can't type the word no in there, you have to type false in there. And my guess is 0 would probably work, but I don't fancy trying it now. So what that will do is download a list of all the files and then filter them. It's always much better if you can filter them before you download them. It works much more quickly. So what I can now do is add another step to present the final information. Guess what? We're going to do an HTML table. So choose to create an HTML table. I'm going to take the output from the previous step, the filter array step. Once again, it presents me with all the individual columns. Choosing any one of these would create an apply to each loop, which I don't want. So I need to find the one which contains all the items. It's tempting to think that's it, the item, but it's not. That's an individual row. And if I were to choose that, it would create an apply to each loop again. So I want the body in this case. As you can see, it's not always easy guessing which property you want to pick up on. So that will return all the rows. What I now want to do is set my custom columns, so I can just choose which ones I want to show. And what I'm going to do is show the display name of the file. You could paste in a name containing a space, but I'm just going to settle for one without a space. I'll call it file name. What else shall I show here? Let's choose the file size. Call that file size. And I think we're good to go. So what I'll do now is save that and try running this to see if it gives me the results. And what I should get out of this is 2 columns in my HTML table. The first column should contain the file name, and the second one should contain the file size, and I will only have the files, and that's worked beautifully. I've only got the 2 rows, so I haven't got the folder because I filtered it out with my filter action. And for each, I've got the name of the file and the file size. And if you're wondering why the amaretto cheesecake has got 0 file size, it's because it is an empty file. I cheated. You wouldn't want to make that cheesecake, it wouldn't be very nice.